great to see my colleagues here who I haven't seen in so long. Usually I'll see y'all passing in a hall somewhere in a city close near and far, but today we have this beautiful pink backdrop and and look, and it's like the rolling hills. It's how nice. So listen, we're here to talk about service mesh. I'm here with LeeCalcote and Bridget Kromhout. How are you both?
Good.
Yeah, very well. Well, welcome to the Hill Country. You've been to Austin, just not. I just haven't had you out to my place. So.
Well, good. So we're talking about service mesh today, and we're talking about the service mesh interface in particular. I've had the chance to interview several people about service meshes over the past few years, and one of the things that I've really learned out of it is, and I think maybe we'll just briefly go over service mesh, and I'll give you kind of how I've been hearing it summed up, and then we can get your perspective. And then I'd really like to get into the customer journey if we can, how it is the customers faring, because they're the ones who are watching this. And is there, as much as the customers, is also there the end users, which are people like yourselves as well. So I heard service meshes described recently as offering a platform for simplifying microservices communication. Just in very basic terms, it handles a lot of complicated pieces around microservices communicating with things through like enforcing policies, managing certificates, servicing issues, relevant telemetry, so you can really understand what's happening in your cluster. And those problems, as we well know, become much more magnified with microservices, and which are, essentially just chaos in some respects, right? So service mesh is this way to just take that burden away from the developers and move it into that infrastructure layer. And so that's basically decoupling the teams in a way, enabling them to be successful at the same time. So teams are meaning like the developers and the operations team. Bridget, does that sum it up for you? Or is there more to it that you would add?
I think so. So probably it's important to remember that it's so easy for us to use these simplified mental models of our cloud native ecosystem.
Right.
And then we look at the landscape and we go, oh no, it's not simple. And
Right.
Our organizations generally, even if they have a few people, aren't simple. And so being able to properly segment who changes what, who has access to what, and who has responsibility for what allows us to kind of limit our blast radius for anything we're working on, and hopefully not have too much context baked into our specific application and too much spillover between roles and responsibilities. What do you think, Lee?
Both of you hit it on the head, actually. I think there were any number of keywords that that a lot of times actually people won't use when they describe a service mesh, but Alex actually mentioned a number of them, and what Bridget had reinforced I really like as well, and that is that you can, like any piece of technology, you can speak to it about in hard technical terms about like what features and functions and capabilities does it have. But much of what the two of you had reinforced was actually maybe sort of the true power of a service mesh, which is, which we mentioned them being a platform. They provide a few things around observability, around helping take the blinders off, around helping get control over that chaos, and actually in a very literal way for how some use a service mesh. But also the decoupling around teams and understanding that there are in any even relatively small sized environment, there are multiple teams with different requirements, and being able to granularly control what those requirements are for that team's service or set of services. Really something that really, it's one of the things that I'm writing about right now as I'm authoring a book through O'Reilly. The first, well, it's not there yet, but the first chapter will say It'll speak to how it is that whether you're a developer, a product owner, an operator, an architect, how a network operator, how the service mesh is very much so empowering of each of those personas. And I think it's easy to overlook that and just to sort of assume that the vast majority of the value of a mesh is oriented towards the operator, which there's lots of value for them. My perspective is that over time, we'll become to realize just how much of both a burden is offloaded off of developers, and also how they are very much so empowered with some new controls over infrastructure that they just didn't have before.
So now when we talk about service mesh, we then start to hear about abstractions such as the service mesh interface. Bridget, what is the service mesh interface, and what does it provide that a service mesh can't? Or is it essentially kind of providing a way to unify service mesh environments?
So I would say the best way to understand the SMI project, and this one was fun when we were writing the proposal to put it in the CNCF as a sandbox project. And it turns out that it's a spec. So it's like, and how many users are there? Well, it's a spec. Many folks have implemented it. But the spec is so that all the people who want to use things like traffic shaping or canary releases without having to build build their application to have canarying in it, people who want to use these things often say, well, okay, cool. I need a service mesh to give me these kind of capabilities. Oh, wow, there are lots of service meshes out there. What's the right one for either me to use as an end user, or what's the right one for me to target as an application developer? And the service mesh interface, say that 3 times fast, project just allows there to be interoperability between meshes such that both end users and application developers don't have to make a lot of decisions up front. Instead, they can evolve their use of service mesh as their needs change without worrying that they lock themselves into a choice that'll make it really hard for them to do anything 6 months down the road.
So Lee, a spec. And what are some other examples of specs in the cloud native ecosystem that we have today that people can provide a corollary for?
Yeah, that's a great way of beginning to understand SMI, and that's to take a look at, well, many other specs that end in I and our 3-letter acronyms. So CNI, Container Network Interface, or CSI, Container Storage Interface. There are a few other examples here that I won't prattle off, but suffice to say that for those projects and those vendors or those products that offer up a network service, in the case of CNI, Container Network Interface, that this is the way of bridging between being Kubernetes native and accessing those network functions. And very much the same way, SMI, Service Mesh Interface, is intended to help provide a ubiquitous set of specs, a set of interfaces for end users to interact with their choice of a mesh, or maybe multiple at the same time. In some respects, while that's like a more technically accurate sort of corollary, one that might be also more a friendly way of thinking of it is, well, it's a bit of like the value that you derive from using something like a Terraform for kind of writing a script or once and having that work across multiple clouds. So you can invest in one interface as you go to build up your muscles and your knowledge around service meshes and their use. And like that you would then find value in SMI, like Bridget said, sort of without fear of lock-in. So
the spec right now is relatively young comparatively to other specs. What stage is it at now? Bridget, what stage are we in with this with the service mesh interface?
Yeah, so if you can read all about it on smi-spec.io if you like. and click through to, we have the GitHub organization service mesh interface as a project under the CNCF. And the APIs that are currently implemented are discussed in there. And some of them are at, V3 alpha or whatever. But we have access control, traffic splitting, traffic specs to define it on a protocol basis, and traffic telemetry. And there's more coming, obviously, but many of the meshes out there have implemented at least this and then some more. And the some more will vary. And this spec continues to grow. So because this is an open source project and an open source spec, you can actually join, take a look on GitHub, see the open issues of the development of the spec as it goes. We have open community meetings every 2 weeks. I mean, much as you would expect from any CNCF project. And I would say that this is I don't think there's any spec out there that is finished, but this is definitely stable, and it is being implemented, and adapters created even for meshes that don't implement it. There are open source adapters to use those meshes. Wow, that word is really hard. To use those service meshes in an interoperable fashion.
So Bridget, let me just follow up with that. So where would you see customers right now? One of the ways that people kind of describe to me service mesh is like, you could have a PhD in networking and still be studying kind of how these meshes integrate with a network, right? So like, it's very, very complicated. And so it was described to me as the people who are using it, they have to just start and learn, and it takes time. It takes a lot of time to learn how these service meshes actually work and how to use them. So what are you finding with customers? What are you finding on their journeys? Is this, to me, it reminds me of learning biology, right? It's like you can't learn it overnight, right? You have to study it, and you have to really kind of take some time with it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Alex. I would say that, like any technology, my advice is always, instead of try this awesome new technology, maybe it'll solve problems for you, is what problems are you trying to solve? Because there are a lot of companies out there, large and small, that provide support for work in this space. Companies like Solo.io have some really great service mesh hub, like unified dashboard stuff that's out there. The Flagger progressive delivery operator, and obviously the fine folks at Linkerd doing an ultralight service mesh. There are so many different choices out there that it's a good idea to start with what problem you're trying to solve. And so if you're, I'm not going to say that there's a perfect decision matrix out there, but I would say take a look at something like Solo's offering and see if, or look at your cloud provider, whatever they might offer, and see if some of the boxes that they tick are the problem you're trying to solve. Because I can't give you a generalized answer as to how to make technology choices. Wouldn't that be amazing? That would be a very lucrative business.
You'd be in high demand. Lee, so perhaps what we can talk about are some of the how you break down service meshes. Like, people are using them for traffic management. They're using them for security, and they're using them for observability. So in traffic management, it may just be, SRE teams in particular are finding they're spending more time on just traffic management within the cluster itself. So perhaps we could start there as an example, Lee, of how someone who is as an SRE, for instance, might be thinking about how to use the service mesh and the service mesh interface.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and to that question of sort of adoption, some of the service meshes very much intentionally, and like SMI, actually, the fact that it has multiple specs, some of the meshes, well, all of them actually, and SMI allow you to, as a user, digest those or deploy those or take advantage of them in a piecewise fashion, a la carte, if you will. So to Bridget's point, that you could, digest your mesh slowly and And once you become comfortable with a particular capability, like the one you were identifying for observability, for SREs, for example, or traffic management for SREs, that yeah, it could be pretty scary. It's kind of an interesting thing that networking goes deep and wide, and that actually service meshes are a little bit of a next gen SDN, except sort of built much more for cloud native, much more for developers and APIs, and to be able to have control over the network in that way. So it's an interesting consideration that, like you'd said, networking and hence service meshes can take a while to digest. But if a developer, if you will, I guess, is ever going to really feel comfortable with fine-grained traffic control, it's probably in this context. This is networking made for developers and operators.
Yeah, being API driven.
Being API driven, right. And so let's take another example. Bridget, how about observability, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things people try to do when they are attempting to measure, see, and understand what's happening in their systems is they want to do A/B testing, or they want to do canary releases, or they just want to look at traffic metrics and feed them into some other tool that they have. It's like the traffic metrics API is one that you can plug into your observability platform or tooling of choice. So then again, you don't have to build the hooks directly into your application as to what you're going to be feeding this traffic into, particularly because people sometimes observe their development and pre-production and production environments differently, just depending on, configuration, budgets, access, et cetera. That's, again, like, you don't necessarily have a lot of large enterprises that are totally cool with individual JRandom application developer mucking around in the production logs, looking at everything. And so having the ability to send certain kinds of your traffic to different places, or see what the percentage completions are without necessarily inspecting every packet. Yeah, those are kind of the granular things that once you start actually implementing this for realsies, you start to care about.
What are some of the other things, Lee, that you're seeing in your own research into your book that you're finding are challenging aspects of people learning how to digest service meshes, and what are they trying? What are the kind of the more significant problems they're facing upon their journey? I would imagine network management and understanding that is a big part of it.
A lot of times that fine-grained traffic control. I'm going to speak in generalities, and I've delivered workshops to about 3,500 folks now on service meshes, and so I've gotten fielded a lot of questions and talked to a lot of folks about who are adopting, and really service mesh adoption is a focus of mine in particular. That I'd say just by pure raw number count, that the majority of folks that I speak to are adopting because they want to get to observability, or that's the piece of value that they need the most, and most critically now is they just don't know what's going on between their services and what's going on. Now that said, there are, I guess, to put some adopters into a box, I would say there's a lot of times you'll find financial institutions are pretty aggressively seeking the easy button for securing and encrypting their traffic in between services. So sort of
and the granular access control.
Totally. So it's secure. Yeah. So the encryption, that package of security is like, and sometimes they just stop there because that was enough, or maybe they take maybe I shouldn't say stop with a full stop, but they take a pause in their journey, become comfortable. And then for some of the capabilities of the mesh, people are getting some of those things elsewhere. It's not like observability and monitoring is a new thing. People have other tools. Meshes integrate into those existing tools. But for some, particularly those that are starting out new projects, if they're doing it in context of a service mesh, or they're aware that one will be in the environment, boy, they can move a lot faster when they just trust that the infrastructure will provide. And that's actually because of all those folks that we've spoken to. It's actually why we started the project Meshery, the Service Mesh Management Plane, which is an implementation of SMI, is to foremost facilitate adoption. Because there's a long tail of people who are coming to adopt service meshes. And so
Bridget, I was seeing some stats that were, according, I believe it was according to the CNCF, about 18, they did some surveys and about 18% of the people said that they're using service meshes. So that's a pretty, that's not quite 20%, but it's still, it's still not zero. I mean, you're still seeing a lot of people. I think comparatively, Kubernetes architectures are upwards of 70%, in their survey are using Kubernetes as a platform. But for those 18%, what are you seeing as some of the day two challenges that they're facing? Because you can get started with a service mesh, but there's always day two, then there's and day three and beyond. What are some of the things that are noteworthy to you that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually recently chatting with Lee specifically around the conformance testing for SMI. This idea that it would be nice if you know that what you're developing and what you have in production works for some values of works and maybe meets some sort of minimum standards. It's very simple to deploy something from GitHub and be like, it works. And it's a lot more of a lift, like you're saying, Alex, the day two operability of, is this replicable? Can we deploy this in, our 80 data centers or our 800 data centers? Can we upgrade it according to our schedule? Can we make sure that we don't have the single points of failure that come from the one-off and the experiment, and instead get into productivity? Because I find service meshes really exciting, and so does Lee, and probably Alex does too. And the vast majority of enterprises, governments, educational institutions, et cetera, out there would really not prefer to spend all their time on the excitement of service mesh. They want to get something done with it. And so that's why we're all working together in the ecosystem to try to make everything a lot more operable. And so that's why my recommendation there would be, go look at the vendors in the space, look at the open source projects in the space. You have very smart people. You probably can implement a lot of these things, but we go a lot farther together if you get involved with SMI, with one of these open source projects, leverage vendors appropriately, and you're going to get a lot more done.
Are you finding now that everyone is virtual due to COVID-19, that you're seeing more open source participation?
I'm not sure if I can quantify it as more, maybe more that a lot of these organizations are realizing that they have to make sure that their staff can communicate effectively remotely. Spoiler alert, I think we'll talk more about that in the conference later today.
Yeah. I just was thinking about the open source participation here in Service Mesh, but in conclusion, maybe each of you could just take 1 minute to think about, to talk about, what do you see coming out of Service Mesh in the next 6 months? Lee?
Yeah, I was going to speak a little further out than that. There's
12 months then.
I'm really excited about some things that, that I think that have yet to be realized about the power of a mesh and its enablement of the service owner, the product owner. There's some intelligence that can be built into the data plane in specific that means that you can get some things with no code change. And if you're a product owner and you've got a choice between taking 2 development sprints and having developers implement what can be done in infrastructure, maybe you'll choose to just let the mesh do that for you. We just got done demoing an example of that at DockerCon a couple of weeks ago as an example of how a product owner is enabled by a mesh. So 12 months, it might be a little bit longer, but I'm hopeful that we would begin to see some of those use cases come out.
Bridget?
I'm excited about seeing people working in the open source spec space, just because I feel like
Great.
a lot of organizations, they're a little bit leery still of letting their developers commit code to an open source project. And I say, okay, a great place for you to participate is testing, validation, and documentation, opening issues against a spec, and that way it serves the interest of your org too.
That's such a professional opportunity too, isn't it? It allows you to meet so many people and to really open your horizons. I've always thought that would be such a cool opportunity for someone who's new to the space to really get into it. I want to thank you both. I would have loved to talk for another hour at least, but there's 18 months at least ahead of us, so I'm sure we'll have the opportunity again. So LeeCalcote, Lee, it's great to see you again here. Bridget Kromhout, always wonderful to talk with you. Thank you both. Look forward to talking soon.
Thanks, Alex.